The young recruits gathered around the armory table, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls as they watched the old man carefully cleaning rifles. One of them, a cocky private fresh out of basic, nudged his buddy and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Look at Grandpa over there. Bet he doesn't even remember which end the bullets come out of." His friend snickered, emboldened by youth and ignorance. The old armourer, wearing his faded red jacket over a simple t-shirt, his white beard catching the fluorescent light, didn't even look up from his work. His weathered hands moved with a precision that spoke of decades, but the recruits only saw an elderly man doing a job they considered beneath real soldiers. Another recruit leaned against the counter and called out, "Hey, old-timer, my grandmother could probably field strip a rifle faster than you." The armourer's sad, serious eyes finally lifted, meeting the young man's gaze for just a moment before returning to his task. The silence that followed should have been a warning, but arrogance rarely recognises wisdom. The old man had been working at the base armory for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed, and the empty house became too much to bear. He'd taken the civilian position quietly, never mentioning much about his past, never correcting anyone who assumed he was just another retiree looking to stay busy. His application had been sparse, his interview brief, and his demeanour so humble that nobody thought to look deeper into his background. He arrived each morning at 0500 before anyone else, and left after everyone had gone, ensuring every weapon was accounted for, every piece of equipment properly maintained. The younger soldiers rarely gave him a second thought beyond the occasional dismissive comment or impatient demand for faster service. He never complained, never raised his voice, never sought recognition. He simply did his work with the same quiet dedication he'd brought to everything in his life, a life whose chapters remained unread by those around him. The challenge came on a Friday afternoon when the armory was particularly crowded. The same group of recruits had been hanging around longer than necessary, their training day finished looking for entertainment. The cocky private, emboldened by his friend's encouragement, approached the counter with exaggerated swagger. "Tell you what, old man," he announced loudly, "I bet you $50 you couldn't field strip an M16 blindfolded. Hell, I bet you couldn't do it in under 2 minutes even with your eyes open." His companions erupted in laughter, slapping the counter and egging him on. The armourer stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged, that same sad seriousness etched into every line of his weathered face. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the recruits took his silence as confirmation of their superiority. One of them added, "Come on, Gramps, show us what you got, or are you too scared to embarrass yourself?" The old man's hands, still holding a cleaning rod, trembled slightly, not from age or fear, but from something else entirely, something the young men couldn't recognize. Finally, the armourer spoke, his voice quiet but clear. The base record for blindfolded disassembly and reassembly of an M16A2 rifle is 41 seconds. The recruits exchanged glances, surprised he even knew such a record existed. The private smirked. "Yeah, well, that record was probably set by some hotshot operator, not some old armory clerk." The old man carefully set down his tools and reached beneath the counter, pulling out a standard-issue blindfold used for tactical training exercises. "I'll accept your bet," he said simply, "but not for money. When I finish, you'll treat every person in this armory, regardless of their age or position, with the respect they deserve." The recruits laughed again, but something in the old man's tone made a few of them shift uncomfortably. The private, however, was too far committed to back down now. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. The armourer shook it, his grip surprisingly firm, and began clearing a space on the workbench. Word spread quickly through the barracks, and within minutes dozens of soldiers had crowded into the armory, forming a tight circle around the workbench. Someone had the presence of mind to grab a stopwatch. A sergeant pushed through the crowd, initially annoyed at the disruption, but curious enough to stay when he understood what was happening. The armourer removed his red jacket carefully, folding it with precise movements and setting it aside. Beneath it, his t-shirt was plain and worn, stretched across shoulders that still carried the posture of a younger man. He selected an M16 from the rack, checked it was clear, and placed it on the bench. The crowd pressed closer, some still laughing, others growing quiet as they watched his preparation. He tied the blindfold around his eyes himself, testing it to ensure no light leaked through, and then stood perfectly still for a moment, his head bowed slightly as if in prayer or meditation. The room's energy shifted from mockery to genuine curiosity. Someone in the back whispered, "Who is this guy?" The sergeant called out, "Ready when you are." The armourer's hands found the rifle without fumbling, without hesitation, as if the weapon were an extension of his own body. "Begin," the sergeant said, clicking the stopwatch. What happened next would be talked about in that barracks for years to come. The old man's fingers moved with a speed and precision that defied his age, defied every assumption the recruits had made. The takedown pins released with practiced ease. The upper and lower receivers separated in one fluid motion. The bolt carrier group slid out as if pulled by invisible strings. Each component was placed in exact position on the bench, creating a perfect layout that would have impressed an instructor. There was no wasted movement, no pause for thought, just pure muscle memory executing at a level that spoke of thousands upon thousands of repetitions. The charging handle, the buffer spring, the firing pin, each piece removed and positioned with mechanical perfection. The crowd had gone completely silent now. The only sounds the metallic clicks and slides of disassembly. Even the cocky private had stopped smiling. Then came the reassembly, somehow even faster than the disassembly. The old man's hands flew across the bench, gathering components in perfect sequence, fitting them together with the confidence of absolute knowledge. The bolt carrier group slammed home. The upper and lower receivers married with a satisfying click. The takedown pins secured with two sharp snaps. The charging handle racked once, twice, the sound crisp and clean. The armourer removed the blindfold himself, his sad eyes blinking once in the fluorescent light, and performed a functions check. The trigger clicked. The selector switch moved through safe, semi and auto, with perfect smoothness. He set the rifle down gently and looked at the sergeant holding the stopwatch. The room held its collective breath. The sergeant stared at the display, his face draining of colour. He looked up at the old man, then back at the stopwatch, then up again. 37 seconds, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, then louder with growing disbelief. 37 seconds. That's 4 seconds under the base record. The armory erupted in chaos, soldiers shouting, pressing forward to see the stopwatch, to verify what they'd just witnessed. The cocky private stood frozen, his mouth open, unable to process what had just happened. Through the commotion, nobody noticed the armory door open. Nobody saw the colonel enter, drawn by the unusual crowd and noise. He pushed through the soldiers, his command presence creating a path, until he stood at the front of the circle. His eyes fell on the old man in the red jacket, and his entire body went rigid. The colonel's face transformed, cycling through shock, recognition, and something like fear. "Everyone out," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Now!" The authority in his tone was absolute. Soldiers scrambled to comply, filing out quickly, casting confused glances back at the armourer who stood quietly by his bench, his expression unchanged. The cocky private hesitated, but a hard look from the colonel sent him scurrying after his companions. When the armory was empty except for the colonel and the old man, the senior officer moved to the door, locked it, and turned back. For a long moment the two men simply looked at each other across the space. Then the colonel came to attention and rendered the sharpest salute of his career. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I apologise. I had no idea. Nobody told me. If I had known—" His words trailed off, inadequate for the moment. The old man returned the salute with equal precision, that same sad seriousness never leaving his face. "At ease, Colonel. There was no way you could have known. I didn't want anyone to know." The colonel lowered his salute but remained at attention, unable to relax. "Sir, you're Sergeant Major Harrison. You're the Sergeant Major Harrison. Marine Corps, 3 tours Vietnam, 2 in Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq. You trained half the special operations armourers in the military. You wrote the manual on weapons maintenance that we still use today. You held the Marine Corps record for rifle qualification for 12 years. You received the Navy Cross for—" The old man held up a hand, stopping him. "That was a long time ago, Colonel. That person doesn't exist anymore. I'm just an old man who cleans rifles now." But the colonel shook his head vehemently. "With respect, sir, that's not true. What you just did, that speed, that precision, that's not something that fades. That's who you are." The armourer's eyes, so sad and serious, finally showed a flicker of something else, perhaps the ghost of who he used to be. "I'm a widower who needed something to do with his hands, Colonel. Nothing more." The colonel moved to the workbench, looking at the perfectly maintained rifles, the immaculate organisation, the evidence of dedicated care in every detail. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why take a civilian position when you could have any training role on this base? Why let those kids treat you like... He couldn't finish the sentence. The old man picked up his red jacket, pulling it back on slowly. Because I've had enough respect to last a lifetime, Colonel. I've had enough salutes, enough ceremonies, enough people treating me like something special. My wife used to say I was always looking backward, always living in the past. When she died, I promised myself I'd try to just be present, just be useful, without all the weight of what came before. These young soldiers, they don't need to know about some old Marines' war stories. They need clean weapons and someone who'll be here before dawn to make sure they're ready. The colonel's eyes were wet now, his composure cracking. But, sir, they were disrespecting you. They were mocking you. The armourer's sad face softened just slightly. They were being young, Colonel. Just like we were once. Just like every generation before them. A little humility from an old man isn't going to kill me. The colonel stood straighter, his jaw set. With respect, sir, I disagree. What happened today, that demonstration, that wasn't about humility. That was about showing them that they don't know everything, that experience matters, that they should never judge someone based on appearances. You taught them something more valuable than any classroom lesson could have. The old man was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands resting on the counter. Finally he nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been hiding too long. Sarah would probably say the same thing. She always did have a way of seeing through my excuses. The colonel cleared his throat, regaining some of his official bearing. Sir, I'd like to make a request. I'd like to bring you on as a senior training advisor. Full military contractor status, appropriate rank recognition, and I'd like you to develop a masterclass for our armourers and weapons specialists. We've got good people, but they could learn from the best. They should learn from the best. The armourer looked around his quiet armoury, the place that had been his refuge for 3 years, and something in his posture changed, straightened, as if an old uniform were settling back onto his shoulders. Outside the armoury, the crowd of soldiers had not dispersed. They stood in clusters, talking in hushed, excited tones, replaying what they'd witnessed, trying to understand who the old man really was. The cocky private sat on the ground, his back against the building, staring at nothing. One of his friends approached cautiously. "Hey man, you okay?" The private looked up, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I called him Grandpa. I mocked him. I treated him like he was nothing." His friend sat down beside him. "We all did, man. We all did." Another soldier, older than the recruits, someone who'd been in long enough to recognize certain things, spoke up. "That movement pattern, that speed, that wasn't just any armourer. That was someone who's done it 10,000 times, someone who's trained others, someone who's been in the shit and needed to know their weapon like their own heartbeat." The words hung in the air, and slowly understanding began to dawn on the gathered soldiers. They'd been in the presence of something rare, someone whose quiet exterior had hidden depths they couldn't fathom, and they'd treated him with casual contempt. When the armoury door finally opened, the colonel emerged first, his bearing rigid and formal. Behind him came the old man in the red jacket, his white beard catching the afternoon sun, his expression still sad and serious, but somehow different, more present. The colonel's voice carried across the assembled soldiers. "Attention!" Instantly every soldier snapped to attention. The colonel continued, "I want to introduce you to Sergeant Major James Harrison, United States Marine Corps, retired. 38 years of service, 3 Navy Crosses, 5 Purple Hearts, Master Instructor for Advanced Weapons Systems. The man who literally wrote the book on weapons maintenance that every one of you has studied." The shock rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Jaws dropped, eyes widened. The cocky private looked like he might be sick. The colonel went on. "Sergeant Major Harrison has been working in our armoury for 3 years. In that time, not one weapon malfunction has been attributed to maintenance issues. Not one. His standards are why you're all still alive." He paused, letting that sink in. "He's agreed to stay on as our senior training advisor. You will treat him with the respect his rank and experience deserve. Understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed back, sharp and sincere. The old man, Sergeant Major Harrison, stepped forward slightly. When he spoke, his quiet voice somehow carried to every ear. "I don't need your respect because of my rank or my record. I need your respect because I'm a human being doing a job, same as everyone else on this base. The lesson today isn't that you should respect me because I'm some decorated veteran. The lesson is that you should respect everyone, regardless of how they look, how old they are, or what job they're doing, because you never know their story. You never know what they've survived, what they've sacrificed, what they carry inside them. He looked directly at the cocky private, who seemed to shrink under the gaze. That young man there made a bet with me, and I won. The terms were that he'd treat everyone in the armory with respect. I'm extending that to all of you, not just the armory, everywhere. The cooks, the clerks, the janitors, the guards. Every single person here has a story, has value, has dignity. Remember that. His words settled over them like a benediction, and more than one soldier felt shame burning in their chest. The sergeant major turned to go back inside, but the cocky private suddenly stood, his voice cracking as he called out, "Sir, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was disrespectful and ignorant, and I have no excuse." Harrison stopped, turned back, and studied the young man for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked over to him. The private stood rigid, terrified, as the old Marine approached. Harrison extended his hand. "You're young. You made a mistake. The question is, what are you going to do differently now?" The private took his hand, shaking it firmly, tears visible in his eyes. "I'm going to be better, sir. I swear it." The sergeant major nodded, that sad, serious expression softening just a fraction. "That's all any of us can do. Be better than we were yesterday." He released the young man's hand and looked around at all the assembled faces. "Now get out of here. It's Friday evening. Go call your families. Tell them you love them. Don't wait until it's too late." The words carried a weight of personal loss that made several soldiers reach for their phones immediately. In the weeks that followed, everything changed at the base. Sergeant Major Harrison's masterclass became legendary, with soldiers requesting transfers just to attend. His teaching style was patient but demanding, respectful but uncompromising. He never raised his voice, never used his rank to intimidate, but somehow got more out of his students than any drill instructor ever had. The armory became a place of pilgrimage, where young soldiers would come not just for equipment but for advice, for perspective, for the quiet wisdom of someone who'd seen the worst of war and still chose kindness. The cocky private, whose name was Miller, became one of Harrison's most dedicated students, arriving early and staying late, driven by a need to make amends that went beyond words. Harrison took him under his wing, seeing in the young man's genuine remorse the potential for growth. On the wall of the armory, the colonel had placed a plaque commemorating the new base record, 37 seconds, with Harrison's name and rank properly displayed. Beneath it, Harrison had insisted on adding a quote, "Speed comes from respect for the weapon, respect for the craft, and respect for those who depend on you." The old sergeant major continued to wear his red jacket and simple t-shirt, continued to arrive before dawn and leave after dark, but now his presence was understood, valued, honoured. He still maintained that same sad, serious expression, still carried the weight of loss and memory in his weathered face, but there was something else there now too, a sense of purpose rediscovered, of usefulness reaffirmed. His wife's photograph sat on his workbench, and sometimes young soldiers would catch him talking to it quietly, explaining his day, sharing small victories. They learned not to interrupt those moments, understanding that some conversations transcend death. The base commander visited personally to thank him, offering promotions and honours that Harrison politely declined. He didn't want ceremony or recognition. He wanted to do the work, to pass on knowledge, to ensure that the next generation understood not just how to maintain weapons, but why it mattered, why every detail counted, why complacency killed. His students learned that lesson not through fear, but through the example of a man who'd spent nearly 4 decades proving it true. Years later, long after many of those young recruits had deployed, returned, and moved on with their lives, they would tell the story of the old armourer in the red jacket who broke the base record blindfolded. They would tell it to their own children, their own students, using it as a parable about judgment, about respect, about the danger of assumptions. Some would return to that base, older and wiser themselves, hoping to find Harrison still there, still quietly maintaining weapons with the same dedication. Some would find him, now even older, his beard whiter, his movements slower but no less precise, and they would thank him for lessons that went far beyond weapons maintenance. Others would learn that he'd finally retired, gone to rest beside his beloved Sarah, but his legacy remained in every armourer he'd trained, every soldier he'd taught, every person who'd learned from his example, that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, that real expertise speaks through action, not words, and that the measure of a person has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character. The lesson of Sergeant Major James Harrison lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that we should never underestimate the quiet ones, the humble ones, the ones who serve without seeking glory, because they might just be the greatest among us.